Welcome to the 2017 Iowa City Book Festival, presented by the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. We would like to thank the sponsors who made this event possible: the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa Arts Council, the Iowa City Coralville Convention and Visitors Bureau, Iowa Public Radio, and the Tuesday Agency. Between events, be sure to visit the book fair at Merge, 136 South Dubuque Street, right next door to the public library on the Ped Mall. There you can shop with authors, artists, booksellers, and more, and enjoy complimentary coffee from the local roaster Wake Up Iowa City. The vast majority of book festival events are offered without charge, but they are not free. Your tax-deductible donation gives us the ability to offer programs like this festival. Please consider supporting the City of Literature by texting the word book to 319-774-7669 and follow the link. Today, we will hear from authors Mike Lankford and Steve Paul. Mike Lankford is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and the author of Life in Double Time: Confessions of an American Drummer, a memoir about his years as a white drummer in a black R&B band. This book was an Amazon editor's pick and was selected by 8 major newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune and the Austin Chronicle, as the best music book of the year. His new book is Becoming Leonardo, an unconventional biography of Leonardo da Vinci. Steve Paul has been a writer and editor based in Kansas City for more than 4 decades. His long newspaper career ran a gamut from local news and politics to long-form features on culture, crime, and food, to extended stints as a book review editor, architecture writer, and editorial page editor. He retired in 2016 in order to focus on books, other writing projects, photography, and more. He's the editor of Kansas City Noir, an anthology of contemporary short fiction, and is the author of the new book, Hemingway at 18, the pivotal year that launched an American legend. Please help me welcome our authors.
We took a quick vote beforehand that we would go alphabetically, so Mike's going to speak first.
I'm going first?
Yeah,
you go first. I was distracted during the conversation. I didn't know what I was agreeing to, but I thought I'd read a couple of very brief things and help me keep track of the time here. And then Steve will go on and we'll do Q&A. Leonardo, Becoming Leonardo. I open with a warning to the reader. Reader, beware. I recommend you keep a legitimate biography alongside this bastard of my brain so as to remain constantly in tune with the truth as it is generally understood. I will provide such a list of recommended biographies at the end. The intent here is to see Leonardo simply as a man sitting across a table covered in ordinary sunlight, absent the halo, dirty fingernails and all, to view him as he was viewed by others during his own lifetime, albeit through a 21st century knothole. I don't think he would approve. Leonardo did not like halos, and he sure didn't like being spied on. I open with, most of them is lost to us, of course. The timbre of the voice, the thoughts visible in his eyes, the physical gestures when happy or sad, the way he walked, his smell, his hands, the habitual grimace his friends knew all too well, but no one bothered to record. All of that is lost. When he was young, there was no reason to write any of it down, and when he was old, he became too hard to describe, too strange. What to do with Leonardo? It's helpful in terms of myth building to have fewer facts rather than more. Were Leonardo born today, we'd have hospital records, blood types of both parents, genealogies going back to Charlemagne, not to mention the views of his neighbors there in the tiny tourist town of Vinci. Fortunately, for the sake of romance and myth, we have none of that, but for a single scrawled entry in a family ledger by his grandfather Antonio, which says, 1452, there was born to me a grandson, the son of Sir Pero, my son, on the 15th day of April, a Saturday, at the 3rd hour of the night. His name is Leonardo. I'll jump ahead a little bit here. Without a doubt, this is young Leonardo, without a doubt, his drawing was a source of solace, of tuning out the world, and of capturing it as well. Consider those early lost drawings, not for their focus on some particular thing, like a twig or a frog, as would be usual, but for what's blocked out. They are psychological documents as well as artistic. Any drawing is. Most importantly, one senses that the act of drawing became his way to learn about a thing. It was how he contemplated the world. One of Leonardo's greatest discoveries as a child had to be the power of his own left hand. It must have seemed magical to him at first, and to everyone else. Not only could it capture reality and put it on paper, but the effort of drawing a thing seemed to inform him as well, as if he knew it better afterwards, as if he owned it afterwards, as if to study something closely enough to draw accurately was to also learn it deeply all over its surface, to absorb the thing through visual touch. For him, drawing was a way of knowing the world, and he learned that as a child. Self-taught, it seems clear. And knowing the world was a defense against it. Drawing would provide him with his role and his disguise. Drawing was central to his identity all of his life until he lost it near the end, but by then he was living with the king and coasting, putting on the occasional pageant, otherwise studying his toes a lot. The micro-events leading up to Leonardo's discovery of what he had at the end of his own left arm must be one of the great untold tales of Renaissance art. In a sense, that hand led him through life and was his most valuable possession. It no doubt produced a flood of fantasies by the age of 10 or 12. My guess would be naked angels and devils and dragons. His later dragons, drawn as an adult, are terrific and show his familiarity with the genre. There were surely family stories about the first time the boy picked up a piece of charcoal and drew on a flat rock. Leonardo's life seemed to generate tales like that, but they too are lost. It's equally likely that Leonardo first saw art in the local pottery industry, where his family had a financial interest as property owners. Designs on the sides of piss pots and jars and their repetitious pattern was something even a child could learn to do, not to mention the joy of shaping the pot itself. It might have been his very first spark, watching that old potter bend over his wheel, scratching his design on the side with a stick, it all blurring together as the pot spun. Early animation. Go forward a little bit. This is Leonardo in his mid-30s to 40s. He's in Milan. Genuine fame was not his in any way that I can see, nor did he seem to be lusting after it. This is to countermand the general biographical notion that Leonardo was universally famous, widely recognized, and had basically conquered the court of Milan, none of which is actually substantiated by anything other than mythology. Genuine fame was not his in any way that I can see, nor did he seem to be lusting after it. Quite the opposite. As much as anything, he seemed to be studying and doing research and laying low. Research not for a project so much as just to know and find out. Study for its own sake. Biographers who insist Leonardo's research was always purposeful and in preparation of some treatise or painting miss the point. If to know something, you must first have a reason to know it. If to know something, you must first have a reason to know it, then your body of knowledge will remain small and limited by your own imagination and predictable needs. It is an institutional approach and shows planning, and likely represents institutional thinking about Leonardo as well. But if, however, you're one of those worthless flakes who study simply to know and be surprised and connect the dots, then the stimulation is endless, as are the ideas. Like any true explorer, Leonardo didn't have a map or a plan of action. He was improvising, finding his own way, a riff-style lifestyle. Now, that last statement, the riff style, laugh style, is actually a reference to Jim McPherson, who, when I studied at the workshop, was my mentor. And that's one of Jim's favorite expressions, a riff style, lifestyle, talking about people like Thelonious Monk or such. It's in there as an homage to Jim. And I dedicated my first book to Jim, and he finds his way. And it's an odd thing, if any of you knew Jim, he was a big influence on my understanding of Leonardo. And I'm sure that would astonish him as well. But I can read you some massacre stories that have to do with a lot of exposed organs and whatnot, leading him, I think, to have an advantage over other anatomists at the time. But I tell you what, I think I will turn it over to Steve to do a little reading, and then we will even have more time for Q&A.
Oh, okay.
So,
all right. That sounds good to me.
oh, thank you. Thank you.
That was really interesting. I was riffing on the riff style, lifestyle. I couldn't help but think of someone I've met a few times over the years, David Amram, the composer, musician, hipster. I mean, the last American hipster in some ways. He's still out there making music around the world. He's in his 80s, pushing 90, I think. I see him every year. He comes to Kansas City for a big festival, and he is a graduate, as I like to think of myself, a graduate of the University of Hangoutology. Anyway,
Well, I think
it feels a little bit like riff style lifestyle.
I think it keeps you young.
Yeah.
You know? It does.
Yeah. Well, listen, thanks so much for coming out. I'm going to talk about my book a little bit and read some brief excerpts. And see where we go from there. Maybe there'll be some dialogue, and then obviously we want to get to questions as well. I'll start just by saying that tomorrow, 100 years ago tomorrow, Ernest Hemingway got on a train in Chicago, started heading west, crossed the Mississippi River for the very first time, got the news of the World Series game in progress between the Chicago White Sox and the New York Giants, and a few hours later disembarked at Kansas City's Union Station, where for the next 6.5 months he worked as a cub reporter on the Kansas City Star. And my book goes into deep detail about what that experience was. I'll talk a little bit about sort of the history of Hemingway biography as well. From Kansas City, he joined the American Red Cross Ambulance Service, went to Italy in June of 1918, and this is the part that people kind of forget, in July 8th when he was wounded, wounded seriously enough to be laid up for pretty much the rest of the war in a hospital in Milan. Hemingway was still 2 weeks away from turning 19. And that's sort of the revelation that, that this young man who didn't go to college, straight out of high school, decided that newspapering and the war would be enough of a college education to keep him going for the rest of his life. So that's essentially the foundation of this book. You know, Hemingway biographers, the first major Hemingway biography came out in the early 1950s by Charles Fenton, in which he did write about Kansas City, and he wrote about Toronto, which the other newspaper Hemingway wrote for. And most other biographers since then have come up with a kind of a rudimentary way to talk about Kansas City, and they all do pretty much the same thing. It was a brief stop, if they write about Kansas City at all. The newspaper was a great newspaper, great regional newspaper, and a national voice for its time. And it had some rules of writing, the famous Kansas City Star style copy sheet. that urged reporters to use short sentences. Those kinds of things were the things that people look at and say, "Oh, Hemingway learned how to write at the Kansas City Star." Yeah, and that's all true well enough. I think I go a lot deeper than that in the sense most biographers have sort of overlooked the details of that. I mean, we've known for many years a lot of the stories that Hemingway wrote while he was at the newspaper. A lot of that research was done in the 60s. And what I set out to do almost 20 years ago when I really started researching Hemingway in Kansas City, I started looking deeply into the newspaper, looking for the context of Hemingway's period there. And I made certain discoveries over the years, including you'll hear about a letter I found from a friend of Hemingway's to him as he was heading towards Italy that was an astounding assessment of this young man's talent that I'd never seen before by any contemporary of Hemingway's. Charles Fenton had the advantage of interviewing the numerous Star veterans who'd worked at the newspaper at around the same time Hemingway was there, but few of them had really detailed memories of who he was. I mean, he was just the apple-cheeked country boy from suburban Chicago. Few had any memories of really who he was at the time. He was a nobody. But 12 years ago, when I found the letter from Tubby Williams, his young friend at the Star, I might as well go ahead and get to that now. It really sort of gave me the confidence to do this book because it told me that there is something new about Hemingway. I mean, can you believe it? Another book about Ernest Hemingway. I mean, I know that's a fair assessment. I went to a biography conference a conference of the Biographers International Organization, which if any of you are familiar with or plan to write biography or write biography, it's an interesting group. I just started going to their conferences a couple years ago. But earlier this spring, I went to the conference in Boston, and the buzzword in publishing right now is slice of life biography. And of the, my good friend Candace Millard, some of you may know her books about Teddy Roosevelt, the assassination of President Garfield, and her most recent book on Churchill. Her books have kind of held up as the gold standard right now of slice of life biography. And I urge everyone, if you haven't read any of her books, to do so. But after I heard that, and after I heard that talk, and realizing that this year alone, I know of at least a dozen books about Hemingway. There's the 700-page Mary Dearborn full life biography. There's a book about Hemingway and Dos Passos. There's the fourth volume rather, of the great Hemingway Letters Project. That should be out any day now. A great project to publish all of his known letters. There are at least 6,000 of them, and this next volume takes us into the early 1930s. That's coming out this month as well. Anyway, of all these books, I've been saying that my book is the sliciest. It's short, it's concise, it pretty much gets to the point. And there are some new discoveries that I felt like, yeah, I mean, for a long time I felt like, you know, why another book about Hemingway? And then as I made some of these discoveries, especially the letter from Tubby Williams, I realized, yes, there's a book project here. One thing, however, for a very long time, I was thinking of this book as Hemingway in Kansas City. And it was only at the biographers conference I went to a year ago, the first time I'd been to this conference, that I had an epiphany while listening to a couple of major biographers speak on a stage pretty much like this, when I heard one of them use the word universal, and I immediately snapped up, pulled out my notebook and wrote down a couple of notes, one of which is my book is not Hemingway in Kansas City, it's Hemingway at 18, and that makes it much more of a universal topic. It forced me, or as I've realized, it gave me the opportunity to stretch the story out to Italy, and to make it much more of a project about a young man creating his own adulthood, in essence. Let me give you the Tubby Williams story. Let's see if I can get to it quickly from here. This is the beginning of chapter 12. Hemingway and Brumback, his friend Tim Brumback, whom he was going to Italy with the ambulance service, picked up their last star paychecks on April 30th, and Hemingway prepared to board the Chicago train the next day. Hemingway was delirious with excitement, Brumback said of his friend's sense of the next adventure. Kansas City had been very good to Hemingway. His friendships with Brumback and Carl Edgar had deepened. He had gotten what he wanted, a chance to prove himself as a writer, a path to independence from his family, an eye-opening experience of a city and its temptations, a sometimes grimy urban wonderland, somewhat like a smaller version of Chicago. Hemingway left Kansas City with a boost of confidence. Some of it was self-contained, forged by his own impression that he had come and conquered. Some of it could be attributed to the kind words and cheery toasts from the chorus of newsroom around him. Hemingway, of course, was a nobody as he departed the brick fortress at 18th and Grand. To some, he was still the apple-cheeked country boy, not very assertive and innocent. We recall that he used to express his determination someday to become a writer, but that is a determination often heard in newspaper offices, Henry Haskell told Charles Fenton years later. I'm going to skip ahead to the next paragraph. It's understandable that older veterans might not have seen the spark of greatness in Hemingway, especially years later as they sifted through memories and tried to reconcile the kid in the distant gray din of the newsroom with the celebrity who dominated American literature and the magazines. He was terrible, said one distinctly grumpy and perhaps envious staffer. It was not uncommon to hear a story like the one Clyde Roberts used to tell on himself and his own experience when Hemingway's name came up in conversation. This is a quote. And he proved how much I knew about writing. I was on police in those days, and it was close to deadline around noon when I phoned the desk with a pretty good story. Charlie Blood was on the city desk. I'll give you a rewrite, man, he said. Who's on rewrite, said I. Hemingway, he replied. Christ, Hemingway? He can't write. Fenton interviewed many of Hemingway's star colleagues and acquaintances in 1952, in the months before a groundswell of popular acclaim would erupt with the publication in September of The Old Man and the Sea. 5 million copies of Life magazine, a book that captured hearts. Still, Haskell and the others surely had noticed, as the sometimes awkward boy they once briefly knew progressed up the ladder of literary fame in the 1920s and 30s. The Star reviewed each of Hemingway's books. The reviews were not always favorable, but they reminded readers of his connection to the newspaper, and the Star frequently took note when its favorite son passed through town. But many of his contemporaries' memories were dim or unsubstantial. Skipping ahead, the most significant testimony of Hemingway's talent comes from Tubby Williams, his fellow Star reporter. Fenton, while he worked on his study of Hemingway's early professional years, never found Williams. Tubby was, quote, a most entertaining soul and very voluble, according to Bill Horn, who would meet Hemingway on the way to the ambulance service and Williams in Chicago after the war. A Star writer once wrote of him, his specialties are being popular and noticeable. And then Roy Dickey agreed that Williams was a glowing personality and further identified himself as the reporting peer who was assigned the task of bringing Ernie in on the Star. Given that perspective, Williams might have had the best view of Hemingway's development. Blah, 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 blah. Anyway, by May of 1918, Williams had moved on to the staff of the St. Louis Globe. In correspondence, he tried to tempt Hemingway with a job opportunity, but mostly he stroked the 18-year-old's burgeoning ego. Tubby's key letter arrived before Hemingway left Oak Park for New York on his way to the war in Italy. He addressed his beloved Hemingstein and urged him to pack a typewriter and send stories back to the Star's city editor, the great Longenbaum. If not, you're just a plain damn fool. And then I've got a long quote, block quote. This is your chance, the opportunity of your lifetime to make the limelight. You can do it. You can do it big. I don't want to flatter you, but I'd give $1 million in cold iron men if I possessed your originality. When I found this letter, there'll be a little bit more, I just almost leapt out of my chair at the research room at the JFK Library. I got a lump in my throat, and every time I read these lines, as I am right now, I get chills, just because of where he goes from here. You see things, you know things, you read human interest like a book, and above all, you can tell it. The letter goes on, and I hope you're curious enough to read the book and see more of that and more of the discoveries that I made in the record, even discoveries that I made moments after I submitted the manuscript. And a few months ago, when it was too late to do anything with, I have come up with the news. In the coda, I did manage to tack on a short story about sort of a legal mystery. Many years ago, when I first started Hemingway studies, right around the time of the Hemingway birth centennial in 1999, I met Michael Reynolds, who was one of the last great Hemingway biographers. He died shortly thereafter, but I brought him to Kansas City for a talk. We had lunch a couple of times, and he urged me to find out whether Hemingway ever testified before a grand jury while in Kansas City. He had a hunch. I tried over the years. I knew judges. I knew people in the prosecutor's office. I could find nothing. We both had thought we knew what the grand jury might have been about. Hemingway spent several weeks, actually a couple of months, reporting on the General Hospital, where ambulance breakdowns, graft, mismanagement, all sorts of things got him at least in trouble with the hospital leadership, and he was really proud of sort of the reporting he was doing, and so it just seemed clear that there must be something having to do with the hospital. Could never find it. But after, as I said, not long after turning the manuscript, I made another swoop into the archives, found a mention of another grand jury, which is a federal grand jury, that was looking into a case, a crazy case, that Hemingway actually had written about as well, a police shootout. Two Kansas City police officers, I'll make this short as I can, two Kansas City police officers had descended on a drug house near downtown. Two other men came up to the house or came near the house, and a shootout ensued. The two other men were federal revenue agents, and these guys were shooting each other. The revenue agents were more injured than the police officers. In April, that was in January, early January of 1918, by April, a grand jury indeed had returned an indictment against the police officers. Seeing that, finding that, I realized, my God, there could be a record. Now here's something really material. I went to the National Archives, which has a really major regional center in Kansas City. Within minutes, an archivist had found a case file, and I got to read some of the depositions. I'm folding this stuff up. There's no mention of Hemingway anywhere until I fold the thing up, and on the back of one of the documents, there was a list of witnesses. And in fact, Hemingway's name is on that list. It was one of those research room moments where I almost shouted. There were people around me, so I couldn't shout, but I mean, I was like, 16 years later, I was able to confirm that. So I was able to write that for the code of the book, but a researcher's job is never done. Last spring, I was in Boston again for another event, and every time I'm there, I try to spend some time at the Hemingway collection at the JFK Library. I'm going through some stuff I hadn't looked at before, trying to gather some things on Cuba and some other miscellaneous. I'm going through a box of miscellaneous items, and I come across a file in this archive box that just had the word court in it. On the tab. I pulled it out, wonder what this is. I could show you a picture of it, but it's a copy of the actual subpoena issued by a judge to Hemingway to testify in this case. Lots of unanswered questions. Did he really testify? I don't know yet. There's still, hopefully there's still some documents I could go after, but what that also told me was that Mike Reynolds had to have, who probably saw as almost every piece of paper in the Hemingway collection, had to have seen that subpoena, and that was where his hunch began. I regret I didn't get around to seeing that piece of paper years earlier, but it remains part of the story, and it sort of confirms the fact that maybe there is some new material to be said about Hemingway. And this boyhood to adulthood experience. I'll leave it there for now. We'll see where we are for.
Well, it occurs to me that the material on Hemingway will never be all in.
Right.
For a very simple reason. My subject is 500 years old, and the exact same thing happened to me. It no more goes to publication, and all of these new things start popping up. So I would have made a number of changes, and wish I could have, but. You're catching a moving subject, and what the questions that future historians will ask are not even questions we can conceive of, and that's a fascination to me. How history distorts these sorts of oversized characters, and how they interpret them for their own time. There's very much right now a lot of modern notion about intelligence and creativity and the Google model of a creative lab, a collaborative lab, and these are all very much modern notions. The notion of, and they make a point of saying we are dispelling this false notion of the lone independent creator. We have decided this is not true, and that it was always networked, and the ideas always came from someplace else, and that. And so it's been misrepresented. The truth of the matter is what we need to hear of our own environment is that collaboration, which is not only necessary and unavoidable, is actually beneficial. And that if you work in an office with, 3 smart people and 9 dumb people, and you are, in conference with all of them, you have a political situation. You may only get ideas from 1 or 2, but you're going to be in a group environment where thank you for the input and blah, blah, blah. And so we shape these stories to tell ourselves what we need to hear. And that's why it's impossible to anticipate what the future will require of these characters. I have a question for Steve, though.
Uh-oh.
You mentioned at 18, 19 he was wounded?
1918, yeah.
Yeah. I always understood that was a mysterious wound, that he was either rendered impotent or that was the myth.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading Mike's book because I know it's a lot about the myths of Leonardo and the facts. Hemingway, and one of the sub-themes of my book, I talk about numerous instances where Hemingway kind of blew his own experience up into self-created myths. He pretended he was at that shootout scene, rolling under a fort as the bullets are flying. If you read what happened, there's no way he was there, And by the time if Hemingway got there, the shooting was over. There are incidents like that where Hemingway kept telling these stories over the years, decades later, a couple that happened in the newspaper, and then his own wartime experience, becomes somewhat transformed as well. But Mike's question speaks to one of the key problems in Hemingway studies and the casual reading of Hemingway, in that Hemingway's impotence is a myth. I mean, and Hemingway's impotence might stem from a reading of The Sun Also Rises, in which it's Jake Barnes, not Hemingway, who had that particular wound. And people make the mistake of reading Hemingway's books and thinking that every central male character was somehow Hemingway. And as Hemingway said, and as we know from research and we know from everything else, Hemingway made everything up. And even though certain experiences, another good example is A Farewell to Arms. And I was talking to somebody just recently. I've been on a book tour. I was up in Michigan over the weekend. I was in Chicago in Oak Park, his boyhood home. And even today, there are people who think that Hemingway was at the retreat at Caporetto, where the Italian debacle during the war.
Bob Dole was there. Bob Dole was there, yeah.
Well, that may be true, but I've never heard Bob Dole talk about Hemingway, but it's possible. But if you read A Farewell to Arms, one can assume that Hemingway was at the retreat at Caporetto, because that's what that book is about. That's the central military action of that book. Well, in fact, the breaking of the Italian line happened on October 24th, 1917, 1 week after Hemingway arrived at the Kansas City Star, and he's reading about it on page 1 of the newspaper. And he doesn't write about it until 10 years later. And as we know, partly from Mike Reynolds' early research for a book he did in the 70s on Hemingway's first war, trying to reconcile what Hemingway knew, what Hemingway read, what were the influences, what was his experience in the war and what were his influences in writing Farewell to Arms. That book was based totally on research. Hemingway had never got to Udine or those places where that book takes place. He did go to Stresa, which is where Frederick and Catherine get in a boat and go up the lake to Switzerland. But as far as the military action is concerned, Hemingway never went there at that time. And all of the research he did to create that book came from his reading and talking to some Italians and that kind of thing. So, no, I believe Hemingway's woundings were, as they've long been described, the 227 pieces of shrapnel in his legs, the machine gun bullet in his knee. I've never read anything credible to indicate that he had, a wound of the groin or something that made him impotent. In fact, he had 3 sons, over the next 15 years.
It raises an interesting question to me, because you have these personalities like Hemingway and Leonardo both who are fabulous in a way. They look at the world and they transform it according to personal needs and other things. And when listening to you, it occurred to me that a fabulist like Hemingway would have been a terrible banker, a lousy businessman, probably even as a newspaper man, he clearly would have run into problems after a while. And yet you look at that kind of personality in society. Our society, I guess what it really measures is us more than him, because we have less tolerance for that. You know, when the question becomes why are there no more Leonardos, you have to sort of look to the institutions around us and how we tolerate these individuals who have a foot in the fantasy world and maybe a toe in the real world and really struggle to make their way, because we don't, especially in America, we don't really have a place. Increasingly, we have less of a place for the imaginative individual, except for that reservation, like Iowa City, for instance, is one of those islands of creativity. But largely speaking, I'm out in Central Oregon, which is timber territory. And if you're working with a chainsaw, imagination is a dangerous thing, you know. So it's not encouraged out there. It's frowned upon in certain ways. So, you know, these are men who came up in a certain milieu. And they were very much a part of that milieu, and they reflect that milieu, and the milieu makes possible how they were able to reach some kind of fruition. And it's different for every age. So, you know, you can ask, what kind of people are we encouraging to become now? And how you can be out of time with your own talents. Had you been born 50 years earlier or later, it would have been a different world for you.
The other day, I was in Oak Park, Illinois. I spoke to, I had a library audience, but then the next day I went to Oak Park River Forest High School, which is Hemingway's high school. I spoke to about 130 English students who had read the first chapter of my book. They came up with great questions, and I felt really proud that they actually read. You could tell that they'd read that chapter. But one of the first things I did, I mean, I'm looking at this crowd. I'm looking at this crowd of students, and many of them are 17 or 18. And I'm wondering, and I told them, I'm imagining that looking out among this group, you know, is there somebody in that room who 5 years later would be sitting in a cafe in Paris writing their first book of fiction? And nobody raised their hand, as nobody imagined themselves raising their hands. Most of them, you know, most of the better students would probably be going off to college. Hemingway never did. Long story about that. But he had the drive, and he had the connections. You know, Gertrude Stein, you know, told him to get out of journalism. I wish somebody had told me to get out of journalism, you know, 3 years into it. But I did what Hemingway didn't do, which was to stay in it for 40+ years, and it probably rotted my brain just as he predicted. But anyway, Gertrude Stein convinced him to get out of journalism, to concentrate on his fiction, and he did really well. And he knew people, and Ezra Pound, and made connections. You know, he's still, his first novel, I mean, he was 25, 26 when Sun Also Rises was published. He was 25 when In Our Time was published. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. That does happen today, although most of the time you have to live in Brooklyn to get published, I fear, or it seems. But anyway, we'll see if anybody else comes out of Oak Park or any other high school and goes on the path of Hemingway.
We have 20 minutes left. Should we open it to Q&A? Yeah. We have
Wait for the mic
moderator.
There's twin geniuses during that period.
Is there a switch on that thing? Yeah.
Well, in that period in the Renaissance, you know, there were twin geniuses, Michelangelo and Leonardo. Was there any interaction between the two?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Leonardo had a big effect on Michelangelo. They were 20-year different generations. And there's a notable encounter between the two. Yeah, they were very different personalities. And I deal with that a little bit. But Michelangelo had the advantage of not only patronage, but he had the enormous advantage of having a readable personality. He was eccentric. He was odd in a million ways. You know the stories. He'd pull off his boots, and the skin came with it, and all of that. But he was a thoroughly eccentric character. But he had such a massive talent. He was great in 5 different things. Leonardo in 3. Leonardo was a cryptic personality, hard to read, and the older he got, the more disguised he became. So eventually, the act of knowing and recognizing Leonardo was an act of the imagination, and I think Leonardo was one of those people who had so few works. He was always a man who was having to prove himself, and so. I think it was very easy to misunderstand Leonardo, and I think Michelangelo misunderstood Leonardo. But with the advantage of history, you can see that if you look at the adoration of the Magi, Leonardo's, you see the swirl of faces looking at Mary. And if you look at the Sistine Chapel, Jehovah reaching out to connect with David or Adam, you have the swirl of faces, Eve and others around. I think there's clearly a lineage there. The key thing is that Florence during this time was a hotbed of creativity. So I don't think there was any sense of propriety as who owned an idea. Now, it's a very interesting notion because today we have this idea of appropriating culture, which is that weird intersection between aesthetics and property law, you know, where if you're not Comanche, you can't do something, and that was not the case then. If an idea came up and you wanted to steal it quick, you know, and put a coat of paint on it and call it something else because they were trying things out. And what happens in the early stage of development of artistic or any number of things, it becomes very different once it matures, you see, and we're in a very mature state now. So I would liken Renaissance Italy very much to like jazz in New York during the 30s. So it's a very radically different atmosphere, and that sense of propriety and ownership wasn't a part of it. Yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Thank you. I'm going to start talking about Mike, but it's going to end up with a question for both of you, so just bear with me. I was fascinated by your introduction. You read your foreword, and I'm assuming that that is written after the book is finished and you're sort of getting ready. Did you write that before you wrote the book?
No, it was the first thing I wrote in the book. The gestation of the book was, I didn't intend to write the book. Okay. The book was an accident. Okay,
slow down, because you're answering the question before I ask it.
Oh, okay.
This is important. Because when I listened to you, I'd read this before, and I read the book already, I thought, what a cosmic irony your foreword is, because you talk about, you know, if you want the truth, set aside a standard biography and next mine, you know, and then judge for yourself. And I just got a copy of this morning's Wall Street Journal, in which Daniel Levitin, one of the great reviewers and writers in America, put your book and Walter Isaacson's book side by side and read them. And I just want to read two quotes to set up the question.
I have not read this review yet.
This literally came out this morning. After he's talking about some things that Mike and Isaacson did, he said, throughout most of their works, I found Mr. Lankford's writing thought-provoking and Mr. Isaacson's thought stifling. Mm-hmm. Wow. And then he quotes that passage that you read about the very opening, beginning with most of him is lost to us. And he quotes that long passage. And then he closes his review, which is a 2-page review, saying, I've read and reread this passage 20 times and marvel at it each time I do. With immediacy and grace, becoming Leonardo starts on a high note and gets better to the very end.
I can live with that.
No.
Thank you.
And I am not being paid for this. I've read Mike's book twice. I read it in manuscript and was stunned. But here's the thing. I want them to know. You wrote and told me, would you like to read a book about Leonardo da Vinci? And I said, no. But you had written this book, and we correspond almost daily for years, and you never mentioned this book at all.
No one knew I was writing it.
So here is the question, and it sort of leads to a conclusion that maybe relates to Steve as well. One time you said there are like 16 facts we know about Leonardo.
Yeah.
You wrote a 300-page book, Isaacson's 600 pages, whatever. What compelled you to start that process? And when you finished, what were you going to do with it? Because I remember what you said you were going to do with it, because you could not anticipate an audience for this book, which leads to my final sort of question. Listening to both of you here, it's sort of like, I'm wondering if the difference between the two of you is the difference between recreating reality, finding it, recreating what's there, and in your case, creating reality, which I think are very different processes. So how did you get to this point, and talk about this creation?
Well, Steve's point actually applies to Leonardo. I asked myself, who needs another biography of Leonardo? I mean, there are shelves and shelves of them, or Hemingway for that matter, you know. But the reality is, if you have something new to bring, hopefully, you know, you can find a reader for it. I did not intend to write this book. I've known about Leonardo and thought a lot about Leonardo in the conventional kind of way over the years, but about 4 years ago, an Amazon page popped up, and there was this biography of Leonardo by a guy named Capra, and it had to do with his science, Leonardo and science. And I read it, and it's a good book, but then I had more questions than answers at the end, so I reread it, multiplied all of the questions. So I got a bigger biography. I got this Charles Nichols biography, and I read it, and I was overwhelmed with questions, marked the thing up. Read it again, had even more questions. I start buying biographies. I read eventually 48 different biographies, and at the end of that time, I came to the realization that everyone's telling the same story. There are the same 16 facts that are being interpreted in a variety of ways, and so I didn't really have a reason for writing the book, but I'd absolutely synthesized all of this material. And at a certain point, honestly, I don't remember writing that introduction or the next page, probably the first 2 or 3 pages. It was almost as if it started itself. And at a certain point, I realized I could do this. But then what would I do with it? Because again, you know, the ship's sinking under all the biographies of Leonardo. So my thought was, to answer Larry's question, was that I'd publish it on Kindle and it would disappear and that'd be the end of the deal. No one knew I wrote it. For a very simple reason, because if you tell someone you're writing a book about Leonardo, they go, what do you know about Leonardo? You know, and then you'd get into this big long thing about research and everything, and it would never, you would never buy enough credibility to do this book. You know, I mean, there's 5 people in the world. Martin Kemp could do this book, and he's already done it. So, you know, what could I do with this book? And that's why that's why no one knew I was writing it. And then when I finally had the thing done, I thought, well, you know, Larry, he's a soft soul. He'll read anything. So I send it to Larry. And Larry, usually he's pretty quick on the email. There was this long pause. I mean, it was like half a day or something. And he finally got back to me, you know, and then there was this slow unfolding of what was going on. But at that point, I had started in on the reconsidering what I had, and something very fortunate happened, and I found a publisher, and as someone was saying earlier in the day, for those of you who are in the publishing or aspiring to publish situation, that once you sell a book, it's a year past that for all of the edits and everything that will occur. And so once, actually it was a mutual contact, Larry knew my publisher. And without telling me, just forwarded the book on. I hear from the publisher. This is the weirdest thing in the world, because just to back way, way, way up, I did tell one person about the book when I first started on it, and that was my agent, Gail Hockman. Turns out Gail had majored in the Renaissance in grad school. She'd done 2 years postdoc stuff in Italy, and Leonardo is her thesis subject. I proposed it to her. She says, no. There are too many books about Leonardo. I could not sell it if I was giving it away. So that's when I stopped talking about it, and I just wrote the book purely out of willfulness, because I felt that everyone was getting them wrong, and I had figured it out. And primarily, here's what Leonardo insists on. You see with your own eyes. If you take a passive position, if you are educated to the point that you are seeing things as they have been seen before, you are not seeing them for yourself. So the first lesson is always to see things honestly, and that is an incredibly difficult thing to do. But these historical characters, two guys well dead, you know, really come back alive once you find that angle, you know, that way of talking about them. And once you can find that vitality when you're within yourself, it really reminds you how important these characters are. Can you find a narrative, and it really just turns into a book. Who else?
Excuse me. When Hemingway was at the Star, did he actually have a beat, or was he just being on general assignment?
Well, a little of both. I mean, over the 6.5 months, the one beat that we know of was called the shortstop run, and that meant he would walk to the police station number 4 at 19th and Baltimore, about 4 blocks from the Star. And then he'd go to Union Station, which was the huge train station, and he'd look for stories there or talk to cops or find out any important people come through. And then he'd go up to the emergency room at the General Hospital and hang out with the ambulance surgeons and, you know, look for knifing victims and just try to tell those kinds of stories. But mostly it was, you know, so that was kind of the beat that we know of, but that's not the only thing he did. I mean, early on, there were a bunch of undertakers near the newspaper, and he'd make the rounds and look for obituaries. You know, some of the grunt stuff that beginners do. But then in that hospital, as that hospital story became, I mean, there was a smallpox epidemic, there was a meningitis epidemic, there were the hospital had 3 ambulances, and they were always breaking down, and so there were a lot of, I mean, that was a daily story for a couple of months. And then they also covered the cops and, you know, police business. He would volunteer to work, you know, like another shift, and he became friends with the night editor. The Star had a morning paper and an afternoon paper. The Star was the afternoon paper. The Kansas City Times was the morning paper for a long time. Hemingway would often kind of hang out and do a double shift, or, you know, and get assigned to other stories by the night city editor. So he did a little bit of everything. And then there's a series of narratives that he wrote. There are a bunch of, and I write about the military recruiting stories that he wrote. He did a bunch of those, and a lot of routine stuff as well. But he didn't have, I mean, it was not, he wasn't the City Hall reporter, or as we think of a beat today, it wasn't City Hall or, you know, the county courthouse or anything. It was a kind of a combination of things, often having to do with crime.
Wasn't it during the time that he wrote the world's famous shortest story?
Well, that's another one of those myths, but...
Well, allow me to tell the story.
Yeah, okay.
The story is, for sale, baby shoes, slightly used.
Never used.
Never, no,
Yep.
no.
Never used.
Never used? Okay.
Never worn, I think
I'll-
is the actual words, never worn, yeah.
Ah.
Which attributed to Hemingway as the saddest story I can tell. And supposedly he wrote that down in Charles Scribner's office, late 40s, early 50s, something like that in New York. But research has been done that has found that kind of, that has found those words in classified ads and in other contexts in the 1920s. So it was not something, there was not something that Hemingway kind of thought of or developed or wrote that early when he's in Kansas City that I know of, but it does emerge later. And it's, again, one of those things that people think they know about Hemingway that it is really maybe not so true.
Where was it a story he told?
No.
No.
No, but it might have been a story that he wrote. Like I said, there is a piece of paper with those words on it in what appears to be Hemingway's handwriting, and he wrote that in Charles Scribner Jr.'s office sometime in the 1940s, I think the story goes.
Well, you have deflated my favorite
I know.
story.
There you go. I mean, there's one myth after another.
I've been telling it
Yeah,
for
I know.
years,
I know.
and
I know.
now I have to stop.
That and the damn cats. The cats belonged to his neighbor. They weren't his cats in Key West.
The famous 5-toed cats? Or
Six-toed cats.
6-toed
Yeah.
cats.
And that's all anybody wants to talk about.
You know, for what it's worth, after the hurricane blew through Cuba, apparently the cats did all right. There was a special news item about that.
Yeah. The Key West at the Key West house, the director and had his staff stay in the house during the hurricane, and they survived, and the house survived, and the cat survived, and that became a news story. The Cuban house, the Finca Vejia, which is outside Havana's on a hilltop, as I understand it, did not suffer any damage except for some downed trees, which is understandable given the winds. But anyway, are we about out of time or
Yep.
one more? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's about all we have time for. So let's thank our
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.